Welcome to my channel.
The Mist over Lochdubh was not the romantic, wispy sort that poets write about. It was a thick, damp, depressing blanket that smelled faintly of sheep wool and wet peat, clinging to the mountainsides like a bad mood. It was a Tuesday morning, which, in the professional opinion of Police Constable Hamish Macbeth, was the worst sort of morning for anything actively resembling police work. Hamish was currently engaged in his favourite countercrime initiative, preventative loitering. He was sitting in the lounge bar of the Tommel Castle Hotel, nursing a mug of coffee that was strong enough to strip paint, and desperately hoping the telephone in the police station down the road had stopped ringing. It had been ringing when he left, a shrill, demanding sound that usually meant Detective Chief Inspector Blair in Strathbane was having an aneurysm about paperwork, or Mrs. Wellington at the manse wanted to report a suspicious-looking hedgehog. Hamish, a tall, gangly man with flaming red hair and a uniform that always looked slightly too large for him, stretched his long legs toward the feebly glowing electric fire. His small, nondescript terrier, Lugs, was currently an inanimate furry lump by his boots, dreaming of rabbits that didn't fight back. "Another refill, Hamish?" asked Rory. The hotel's barman, a man whose cheerfulness was entirely dependent on the level of whiskey in his own system. Currently, it was low. "Aye, Rory! The stove at the station is acting up again," Hamish lied smoothly. The stove was fine, he just didn't want to be there. And maybe a scone, if you have one that isn't hard enough to be used as evidence in an assault case. Rory grunted and shuffled off toward the kitchen. Peace reigned. Outside, the wind whipped rain against the sash windows, blurring the view of the loch into a grey smear. Hamish closed his eyes, contemplating the divine state of doing absolutely nothing. The peace was shattered by the main door banging open, admitting a blast of cold air, and a man who looked like he had stepped straight out of an advertisement for expensive, unnecessary outdoor equipment. The newcomer was perhaps 40, with teeth too white for nature, and a haircut that cost more than Hamish's monthly grocery bill. He wore a brand new barber jacket that fairly squeaked with virgin wax, pristine Le Chamois Wellingtons, and an expression of profound dissatisfaction. He did not look like a man who had come to the Highlands to admire the heather. He looked like a man who had come to file a complaint against it. He strode to the bar, ignoring Hamish entirely. Rory reappeared, placing a rock-hard scone in front of Hamish. He eyed the newcomer with the innate Highland suspicion reserved for anyone driving a car costing more than a tractor. "Can I help you?" Rory asked, in a tone that suggested he hoped he couldn't. "I certainly hope so," the man said. His voice was loud, clipped, and unmistakably home county's English Sassenach of the highest order. "I require a double espresso. And do you have oat milk? I find cow dairy terribly inflammatory." Silence stretched in the bar, thicker than the mist outside. Rory blinked slowly. Hamish picked up his scone and examined it with deep interest, hiding a smirk. "We have milk," Rory said flatly. "From a cooer, not an oat." The man sighed, a loud, performative exhale, signifying the burden of dealing with primitives. "Fine, skimmed then. Can't. I need to know who I speak to about the appalling state of the road up to the old MC Entire Croft. I've just bought the place, and my Range Rover nearly bottomed out twice. It's unacceptable." Hamish lowered his scone. The MC Entire Croft had sat derelict for 20 years on the high ridge overlooking the village. It was a beautiful, desolate spot, beloved by golden eagles and hikers who knew how to shut gates. "You bought the MC Entire place?" Hamish said, his voice soft and lilting. The newcomer turned, noticing the policeman for the first time. His eyes did a quick appraisal of his fitting uniform, scuffed boots, general air of lassitude, and dismissed him instantly as irrelevant. "I did, Crispin Croft. Ethical Horizons Investment Group," he announced, offering the title like a business card. "I intend to turn that heap of stones into an eco-conscious, carbon-neutral retreat for high-net-worth individuals needing to reconnect with their essence. I'm knocking the whole thing down next week to build a glass frontage structure." Rory dropped a glass. It didn't break, but the noise was sharp. "Knocking it down?" Hamish asked mildly. "It has been there since the clearances, Mr. Croft." "Exactly. Old, damp, inefficient," Croft snapped. He took the espresso Rory slammed down in front of him and grimaced at the taste. "Progress, officer. You people up here seem allergic to it. I'm bringing money into this depressing little puddle of a village. I expect a certain level of service from the local infrastructure in return." He threw a £10 note on the bar, not waiting for change, and marched toward the door. He paused with his hand on the brass latch and looked back at Hamish. "Trad isn't graded by Friday. I shall be calling your superiors in wherever the actual police station is located. Strathbane, is it? Good day. The door slammed again. The silence that followed was heavier than before. Rory picked up the £10 note and stared at it as if it might bite him. An eco-conscious retreat for high-net-worth individuals, he repeated, mimicking Croft's accent poorly but enthusiastically. He's going to knock down old Angus MC Intyre's home to build a greenhouse for rich idiots. Hamish sighed, a long, mournful sound that came from the very depths of his soul. He finally dunked the adamantine scone into his coffee to soften it. Aye, well, Hamish said, addressing the soggy crumbs. He seems like a man in a terrible hurry to make enemies, Rory, and in Lochdubh, that's a race that usually has a very messy finish. Hamish finished his coffee, feeling the familiar, sinking sensation of impending doom. The quiet week he had planned was dead. He stood up, stretched, and nudged Lugs awake with his boot. Come on, boy, he muttered. Wednesday best go back to the station and see who he complains to first. If we're lucky, the phone line's blown down in the wind. He was not, Hamish reflected as he stepped out into the driving rain, ever that lucky. The Sassenach had arrived, and trouble, as inevitable as the midges in summer, would follow him. The walk back to the police station was a short, damp ordeal that left Hamish's red hair plastered to his forehead and Lugs looking like a discarded floor mop. Hamish had just managed to kick off his sodden boots and coax the temperamental peat stove into a reluctant glow when the telephone began its rhythmic, electronic screaming. She stared at it for a long moment, wondering if he could pretend the moisture in the air had finally short-circuited the device. But the persistent ringing had the frantic quality of a villager who had seen something they couldn't unsee. Lochdubh Police Station, Constable Macbeth speaking, he sighed, leaning against the desk. Hamish, it's Archie McLean. You've got to get up to the MC Intyre place, man. It's the Sassenach, the one in the fancy jeep. Archie's voice was high-pitched, vibrating with that particular brand of Highland excitement that usually preceded a long period of communal gossiping. If he's stuck in the mud, Archie, tell him to wait for a tractor. I'm not a breakdown service, Hamish replied, though his stomach gave a small, prophetic lurch. It's not the mud, Hamish. He's in the sheep dip. And I don't think he's enjoying the soak. He's as dead as a tinned herring. Hamish closed his eyes. The peace of the afternoon didn't just shatter, it evaporated. He pulled his wet boots back on, grabbed his waterproof cap, which smelled strongly of old dog, and whistled for a reluctant Lugs. The drive up the rutted track Crispin Croft had complained about was a bone-jarring journey that tested the suspension of Hamish's ancient Land Rover. The mist was even thicker up on the ridge, turning the stunted trees into reaching skeletal fingers. He found the Range Rover idling near the ruins of the MC Intyre Croft, its headlights cutting twin tunnels of white light into the gloom. Nearby stood the old stone sheep dip, a relic of the days when the hills were white with thousands of Cheviot sheep. Archie McLean was standing several yards away, clutching his cap to his chest and looking remarkably pale. Hamish approached the stone tank, humiliating end for a man who had talked so loudly of reconnecting with essences. Crispin Croft was folded into the narrow, waist-deep trough of murky, chemical-smelling water. He was face down, his expensive barber jacket hiked up over his ears, and his pristine Le Chameau boots kicking uselessly at the air. He looked less like a high-flying investment mogul and more like a discarded mannequin. I found him just like that, Archie stammered, his eyes darting toward the body and away again. I was checking the fence line, saw the lights of the car. Thought maybe he had broken down, but then I saw the legs. Hamish didn't say anything. He moved around the perimeter of the dip with a slow, deceptive laziness that masked the fact that his blue eyes were recording every detail. He noted the way the gravel had been scuffed, the position of a dropped leather glove, and the fact that the Range Rover's driver's side door was wide open. There were no signs of a struggle, no muddy footprints of a second person, yet something felt fundamentally wrong. Croft was a fit man, falling face first into a narrow sheep dip, and failing to climb out suggested either a spectacular level of clumsiness or that he had been helped along. He knelt, his joints creaking, and peered at the back of Croft's head. A small, dark smudge was visible through the expensive haircut, a bruise that could have come from hitting the stone edge of the tank, or from something much heavier. Aye, Archie, Hamish murmured, more to himself than the crofter. He's dead all right, and he's gone and done it in the most inconvenient way possible. He looked at the grey sky, feeling the first sharp stabs of a headache. In a few hours, the road would be choked with white and blue cars from Strathbane. GCI Blair would arrive, shouting and smelling of stale cigarettes. and would likely blame Hamish for the weather, the murder, and the state of the Scottish economy. Hamish reached into his pocket, found a piece of string and a half-eaten peppermint, and sighed. He didn't need high-tech forensics to tell him that Crispin Croft hadn't simply tripped. He had been a man who walked into a village and told everyone their history was a heap of stones. In Lochdubh, people had long memories and very short tempers when it came to their stones. "Go home, Archie," Hamish said softly, "and try not to tell more than 10 people before I get back down to the village. I need to make the call." As Archie scrambled away, Hamish stood alone in the rain with the dead Sassenach and a dog that wanted its dinner. The silence of the hills was absolute, broken only by the ticking of the cooling Range Rover engine. It was a perfect, peaceful Highland murder, and Hamish Macbeth knew his life was about to become a misery. The wail of sirens eventually cut through the mist, a harsh, urban sound that felt like a physical assault on the silence of the ridge. Hamish stood by the Land Rover, his hands deep in his pockets, watching the flashing blue lights bounce rhythmically against the fog as a convoy of vehicles climbed the track. First came the local doctor, looking harried, followed by the mobile crime lab, and finally, a black sedan that took the ruts with a violence that suggested the driver was taking his frustration out on the axle. The sedan screeched to a halt, and out stepped Detective Chief Inspector Blair. He was a man who seemed to have been constructed entirely out of angry circles around. Red face, a protruding stomach held in check by a straining waistcoat, and small, piggy eyes that were currently fixed on the mud splashing onto his polished shoes. Following him, like shadows of a less aggressive species, were Detectives Anderson and MacNab. "Macbeth," Blair roared, his voice echoing off the stone ruins of the croft. "You couldn't have found a corpse in a heated drawing room, could you? You had to find one on top of a mountain in the middle of a bloody monsoon." "Good evening to you too, sir," Hamish said mildly, his Highland lilt lengthening as it always did when he was being insulted. "I didn't choose the location, sir. Mr. Croft did that himself." "Don't get smart with me, you long streak of nothing," Blair snapped, puffing as he stomped toward the sheep dip. He peered over the edge at the body of Crispin Croft, his nose wrinkling in disgust. "God, the smell!" "What is that?" "Chemicals and wet wool. Sheep dip, sir. Arsenic-based, mostly." "It's an old tank." Blair waved a meaty hand dismissively. "Well, it's obvious, isn't it? Look at the state of this road. Look at those ridiculous boots he's wearing. Man's a city type. He's come up here, got disoriented in the fog, tripped over his own ego, and drowned in a puddle. It's a tragic accident caused by sheer English incompetence. Case closed. Anderson, get the photographers to finish up. I want to be back in Strathbane before the pub's shut." Hamish cleared his throat softly, a sound that usually preceded him being shouted at. "There's a bit of a bruise on the back of his head, sir, just under the hairline. And his car door was wide open, but the keys are in his pocket." Blair turned on him, his face deepening from its usual boiled ham pink to a dangerous shade of beetroot. "A bruise? He fell into a stone tank, Macbeth. I would be surprised if he didn't have a bruise. And as for the car door, the man was probably panicking, looking for his bearings." "Are you trying to tell me how to do my job? Are you suggesting this is a murder in Lochdubh? Who'd want to kill a man who's bringing investment to this godforsaken heap of heather?" "I'm just saying it's worth a look, sir," Hamish replied, adopting an expression of vacant helpfulness. The villagers were not exactly fond of his plans for the entire place. The villagers are never fond of anything that doesn't involve poaching or drinking themselves into a stupor. Blair sneered. He turned back to Anderson. "I want a quick autopsy report to confirm the drowning. In the meantime, Macbeth, you can stay here and guard the scene until the recovery team hauls him out. And for heaven's sake, try not to lose any more evidence, not that there's any to find in this mess." Blair stomped back toward his car, shouting orders at the forensic team to hurry up. He didn't see Hamish lean down to pick up a small, shimmering object from the gravel near where Croft's Range Rover had been parked. A tiny, bright blue feather lay there, seemingly lost in the dust, far too delicate to have come from a crow or a hawk. Hamish tucked the feather into his pocket and watched as the DC's car turned around and sped back down the hill, leaving him alone in the dark with the dead man and the smell of chemicals. Blair had already decided it was an accident because it was the easiest path, but Hamish knew better. Croft hadn't tripped. He had been standing by his car, talking to someone he likely knew, before he was struck. "Well, lugs," Hamish whispered, the dog looking up with sympathetic eyes. "The big man says it's an accident, which means we'll have to do the real work while he's busy taking the credit for nothing." He looked toward the village lights flickering far below in the valley. "Tomorrow, The gossip would be flowing faster than the River Tommel, and Hamish knew exactly where he needed to start his mooching. The grey light of Wednesday morning found Hamish Macbeth back in the village of Lochdubh, his Land Rover parked at a precarious angle outside the police station. He had spent a miserable, bone-chilling night on the ridge until a bored junior constable from Strathbane had arrived to relieve him. Now, his long, gangly body ached with a deep, damp cold that only a peat fire and several cups of very strong tea could hope to cure. He did not go straight into the station, however. He knew that if he did, the telephone would likely ring with more barked orders from DC Vast Blair. Instead, he made his way toward the post office and general stores. This was the true nerve center of the Highlands, a place where the news of Crispin Croft's death would already be simmering like a pot of thick Scotch broth, seasoned with various imaginative layers of local speculation. Mrs. Kennedy, the postmistress, was behind her counter, her spectacles perched precariously on the end of her sharp, inquisitive nose. She was currently lecturing a bewildered-looking tourist on the proper way to lick a stamp without offending the monarchy. When she saw Hamish enter, her expression shifted instantly from stern authority to conspiratorial delight. She enjoyed a good tragedy, provided it happened to someone she didn't particularly like, and the Sassenach had been at the very top of her list of grievances. "Oh, Hamish," she began, not even waiting for him to reach the counter. "The Sassenach has gone and drowned himself in a sheep dip. A bit dramatic, don't you think? It's caused a terrible stir. The telephone hasn't stopped ringing since 6 o'clock. Everyone wants to know if he was pushed or if he just tripped over his own arrogance." "I, Mrs. Kennedy. It's a sad business, truly," Hamish replied, his voice a masterpiece of feigned mourning. He leaned against the wooden counter, looking like a man who had nothing but time. "I don't suppose he was a regular visitor in here. A man like that usually has a lot of business to attend to, even in a quiet place like this." Mrs. Kennedy snorted, a sound like a small explosion. "Regular? He was in here 3 times last week alone, complaining about the delivery of his specialist groceries, wanted organic avocados and some sort of milk made from nuts. I told him he was in the Highlands, not a London health spa. He was a rude, impatient man. Hamish. He had no respect for the pace of life here. And the mail. Thick envelopes from London lawyers arrived for him every single day. He was suing someone. I would wager my entire pension on it. He had that look about him, the look of a man who uses the law like a club to hit people with." Hamish tilted his head, his blue eyes guileless. "Suing someone. Did you happen to see a name on those envelopes, Mrs. Kennedy? Just so I can help the DCI with his paperwork, you understand. He's very keen on the details." She leaned in closer, her voice dropping to a theatrical whisper that could have been heard in the next county. Most were from a firm called Sterling and Vance. But there was one he sent out himself, just yesterday afternoon. He was quite agitated when he posted it, pacing back and forth like a caged beast. It was addressed to Colonel Halberton Smythe. Now, why would a man like that be writing to the Colonel in such a state? The Colonel is a gentleman, and that Croft creature was, well, he was a different breed entirely. Hamish felt a flicker of genuine interest. The Colonel was Priscilla's father, the owner of Tommel Castle. If Croft was entangled with the local gentry, the case was about to get much more complicated and significantly more dangerous. He thanked Mrs. Kennedy, declined a stale ginger nut that looked like it had survived the Great War, and wandered back out into the damp street. The village was fully waking up now. Smoke curled lazily from the chimneys, and the smell of frying bacon drifted from the open kitchen door of the hotel, making Hamish's stomach growl in protest. He ignored the hunger, heading instead for the small shop run by Mr. Patel. The Lochdubh Curry House and newsagent was a modest establishment, but Mr. Patel was a keen observer of human nature and saw everything that happened on the waterfront. Inside, the air was a wonderful, warming mix of turmeric, cumin, and old newsprint. Mr. Patel was polishing the glass of the refrigerated display with a methodical intensity. "A bad business on the hill, Macbeth," he said without looking up from his task. The Englishman was a man of many words, but none of them were kind. "He was here yesterday, you know." "That seems to be the consensus, Mr. Patel. Did he say anything of note?" "He was driving that big silver car of his. He stopped here to buy a map of the old parish boundaries and a pack of expensive cigarettes. He was shouting at someone on his mobile phone the entire time, something about the rights of way and removing the local obstacle. He looked very angry, Macbeth. His face was the color of a tandoori oven. Did he mention who the obstacle was?" Mr. Patel shook his head, finally looking up. "Number." But after he finished his call and drove off, A woman came by. A stranger, not a villager. She was wearing a very fine coat, a bright blue one, with a hat to match. She was asking for directions to the MC entire croft. She didn't look like the sort of lady who enjoys a walk in the Highlands. Hamish reached into his pocket and felt the delicate blue feather he had found at the crime scene. A blue hat, you say, with feathers on it, perhaps? Exactly. Like a tropical bird lost in the rain. She went up the track just an hour before the mist came down. Hamish nodded slowly. A woman in a blue hat, a threatening letter to the colonel, and a dead man in a sheep dip. DC4's currently in Strathbane writing a report on a tragic accident, but the pieces Hamish was gathering did not fit that puzzle at all. He needed to find out exactly who this mysterious woman was, and more importantly, why the colonel was involved. He stepped out of the shop, the Highland wind tugging at his red hair. He could see the towers of Tommel Castle in the distance, rising through the thinning fog like a silent warning. It was time to pay a long overdue visit to Priscilla. Not just for the information, of course, but because she always had the very best tea, and he was currently cold enough to consider arresting himself just for the simple, radiating warmth of a cell. The drive to Tommel Castle stood as a monument to a time when wealth was measured in granite and acres, rather than digital portfolios and eco-retreats. Hamish navigated the winding driveway, his Land Rover protesting the incline with a series of metallic wheezes that sounded like a bagpipe dying in a gale. He parked near the side entrance, the one that led directly to the kitchens, knowing that a formal knock at the front door would only invite the icy scrutiny of the colonel's butler. Lugs, sensing the shift in social status, remained in the vehicle, settling onto the passenger seat with a disgruntled sigh that suggested he preferred the company of crofters to the aristocracy. Hamish stepped out into the biting air, adjusting his tier rare concession to the location, and made his way inside. The kitchen was a cavernous space smelling of rosemary and floor wax. He found Priscilla Halberton-Smythe there, leaning against a heavy oak table, staring out of a tall window at the mist-shrouded loch. She was as striking as ever, her blonde hair caught in a casual knot, wearing a cashmere sweater that probably cost more than Hamish's entire winter wardrobe. She turned as he entered, a small, knowing smile playing on her lips. It was a smile that always made Hamish feel both seen and entirely transparent. "Hamish," she said, her voice like fine silk, "I heard you were busy on the ridge last night. The village is already humming with the news of poor Mr. Croft, or perhaps poor isn't the right word, given how much everyone seemed to dislike him. It's a terrible business, Priscilla," Hamish replied, his voice dropping into its most humble, unassuming register. DC Vars, Blair is convinced it was a slip of the foot, but I find myself troubled by the small things. A man doesn't usually go for a midnight swim in a sheep dip, unless he has had a very persuasive reason. Priscilla sighed, walking over to the stove where a copper kettle was beginning to whistle. He was an insufferable man, Hamish. He came here last week to see my father. He didn't ask for an appointment, he simply marched in, as if he owned the place. He had some preposterous idea about a right-of-way through our lower pastures to reach his eco-resort. He threatened to sue if we didn't grant it. My father, as you can imagine, did not take it well. There was a great deal of shouting about upstart Sassenachs and modern vandalism. Hamish accepted the cup of tea she offered, letting the heat seep into his chilled fingers. Mrs. Kennedy mentioned a letter Croft sent to the colonel yesterday. "Do you know anything about that?" Priscilla's expression darkened slightly. "I saw it on the hall table this morning. It wasn't a request, Hamish, it was an ultimatum. Croft claimed he had found some obscure Victorian land deed that proved the road to the MC entire. Croft actually cut through our property in a way that gave him leverage over our boundary fences. He was going to make life very difficult for us, unless father backed down. It was a petty, vicious move. And your father? How did he react to the letter?" He was livid. "He went out for a long walk yesterday evening to clear his head, as he puts it. He didn't come back until quite late, soaked to the bone, and in a foul temper." She paused, her eyes searching Hamish's face. "You don't think my father had anything to do with this, do you?" "He's a man of temper, yes, but he's not a murderer." Hamish took a slow sip of his tea, staring into the amber liquid. "I'm sure he isn't, Priscilla, but Croft seems to have been playing a dangerous game with several people at once. Did he have any visitors? A woman, perhaps, one who might wear a bright blue hat with feathers." Priscilla froze, the teapot still in her hand. "A blue hat? You mean Penelope? Penelope Vane? And who might Penelope Vane be?" "She's a property developer from London. A rival of Croft's, though I heard they were once partners in business and perhaps more. She arrived at the hotel yesterday afternoon. I saw her in the lobby. She was dressed quite spectacularly for Lochdubh. She and Croft had a very public, very heated argument near the docks. Something about a betrayal and a stolen contract. She looked capable of a great deal more than just shouting. Hamish reached into his pocket and pulled out the tiny blue feather, laying it on the table between them. I found this by the sheep dip. It's a very fine thing, isn't it? Not at all like the feathers you find on a Highland grouse. Priscilla looked at the shimmering blue object, her breath catching. That matches her hat exactly, Hamish. She was wearing a fascinator with those very feathers, if she was up at the Croft last night. Then she has some explaining to do, Hamish finished. He drained his cup, feeling the warmth finally reaching his toes. But Blair won't listen to a word of it. He wants this closed as an accident, so he can go back to his comfortable office in Strathbane. Hell, see a London lady, and think she's far too grand to be a suspect. And what will you do? Priscilla asked, her eyes bright with a mixture of concern and admiration. Hamish stood up, his tall frame nearly reaching the low kitchen beams. He looked, for a fleeting second, like a man who was very far from lazy. I think I'll go and have a quiet chat with Miss Vane. Maybe ask her if she's lost any of her finery. And then I'll see if the Colonel is feeling any more communicative about his evening walk. I'd best be going, Priscilla. The tea was wonderful, as always. As he walked back to his Land Rover, the mist was beginning to lift, revealing the jagged peaks of the mountains. The investigation was widening, drawing in the local gentry and the London elite, but Hamish knew the answer lay in the small human details. A letter, a feather, and a man who thought he could buy the Highlands. The trap was starting to form in his mind, but first, he had to navigate the treacherous waters of the upper class without getting himself fired or worse, promoted. He climbed into the driver's seat, lugs giving him a welcoming lick, and turned the key. The game was afoot, and for once, Hamish Macbeth was wide awake. The Land Rover's engine roared to life with its usual cacophony of groans and rattles, a stark contrast to the elegant silence that usually permeated the grounds of Tommel Castle. Hamish gripped the steering wheel, his mind a whirlwind of possibilities. Penelope Vane provided a perfect target for his inquiry, yet he couldn't shake the nagging image of the Colonel. A man of rigid principles and an even more rigid temper, wandering the mist-shrouded hills with a grievance burning in his chest. Lochdubh was a place where old grudges were nurtured like rare orchids, blooming in the damp shadows of the glens. Croft had been a catalyst, a man who had blundered into this delicate ecosystem with the grace of a bulldozer. Hamish knew he had to tread carefully. If he pushed the Colonel too hard, he would face the wrath of the local establishment. If he ignored the clues, a killer would walk free, and Blair would claim a victory for his own laziness. He drove slowly down the long gravel driveway, the tires crunching with a rhythmic persistence. He thought about the blue feather, so out of place in the rugged Highlands, a symbol of a world that didn't understand the quiet, lethal weight of the mountains. He would start at the hotel, mooching for information under the guise of a routine check. He would listen to the whispers of the staff and the complaints of the guests. In Lochdubh, everyone had a secret, and most were willing to share them if they thought the listener was too simple to understand the implications. Hamish smiled to himself, a lean, predatory expression that Lugs watched with silent interest. The Sassenach was dead, the mystery was deepening, and the tea at the castle had been excellent. It was, all things considered, a very productive morning for a man who was supposedly trying his best to avoid any real work. He turned onto the main road, the loch appearing like a sheet of hammered silver through the thinning trees. The air was crisp now, the rain having finally retreated to the higher peaks. He felt the weight of the investigation settling on his shoulders, a familiar burden that he carried with a deceptive ease. He would find the truth, not through force or shouting, but by being the one person who truly knew how to wait. The village was waiting too, its windows like eyes watching his progress. He pulled up near the hotel, the scent of wood smoke and damp earth filling the cabin. It was time to find Miss Vane and see if her stories were as colourful as her hat. He checked his reflection in the rearview mirror, smoothing down his unruly red hair and adjusting his hat to a more professional, if still slightly rakish, angle. He was ready. The Highland detective was on the prowl, even if he looked like he was just looking for a place to nap. The day was young, the trail was fresh, and the ghosts of the MC entire Croft were finally starting to speak to the only man who knew how to listen to the silence of the glens. The lobby of the Tommel Castle Hotel smelled of floor wax and the lingering, slightly greasy ghost of 1,000 fried breakfasts. As Hamish pushed through the heavy revolving doors, he felt the immediate, prickly sensation of being watched. It was not just the stuffed stag heads on the walls with their glass-eyed judgment. It was the sharp, narrowed eyes of Mrs. Curry, the manageress, who was currently rearranging a vase of wilted heather with the intensity of a general preparing for a siege. "He is in there, Hamish," she hissed, pointing a trembling finger toward the residence lounge. "The big man from Strathbane. He has been shouting for more coffee and demanding the guest list, as if we were all hiding a nest of Russian spies in the linen closet. He has no manners at all, that one." Hamish gave her a soothing, tired smile. DC vies Blair as a man who enjoys the sound of his own voice, Mrs. Curry. It saves him the trouble of having to think. "Is the London lady still here, the one with the fancy hats?" Mrs. Curry's mouth thinned into a line so narrow it practically vanished. "Miss Vane?" "She is in the lounge too, smoking those long, thin cigarettes that smell like a burning perfume factory. She has been in a foul mood since she arrived, complaining about the damp and the lack of a proper cocktail hour. If you are looking for her, you had better be careful. She has a tongue that could clip a hedge." Hamish thanked her and sauntered into the lounge, his gait slow and deliberate. The room was a sea of heavy tartan upholstery and dark wood. Penelope Vane was perched on the edge of a velvet wingback chair, looking like a displaced bird of paradise. She was indeed wearing a hat, though it was a smaller, more discreet number than the one described by Mr. Patel. However, it was the same electric blue. Hamish noted with a silent, sharp interest that one side of the decorative trim looked slightly ragged, as if a small ornament or a feather had been recently torn away. "Miss Vane?" Hamish asked, removing his cap and looking as non-threatening as a man of his height could manage. "I am Constable Macbeth. I am sorry to bother you, but I am just doing a few routine checks following the unfortunate accident up at the MC in Tyre Croft." Penelope Vane exhaled a long, thin stream of smoke, her eyes raking over Hamish with bored contempt. "An accident, is that what you are calling it? From what I have heard of this primitive little village, I assumed you would all be dancing around a bonfire celebrating. Crispin Croft was not exactly a local hero, was he?" "He was a man who made an impression, certainly," Hamish said, leaning against a side table and looking wistfully at a plate of digestive biscuits that sat just out of reach. "I believe you knew him? Professionally, of course." "We were associates," she said, her voice dripping with practiced indifference, "until he decided that association meant stealing my investors for his ridiculous Highland project. I came here to tell him exactly what I thought of his ethics, or lack of it, but I did not see him yesterday evening. I was right here, nursing a very mediocre gin and tonic and wondering why I had ever left Mayfair." "Right here all evening?" Hamish asked softly. "Even when the mist came down around 6? "Especially then. I am a Londoner, Constable. I do not do fog unless there is a taxi involved." Before Hamish could probe further, the double doors of the lounge burst open with a violence that made the crystal chandelier rattle. DC Furs Blair marched in, his face a triumphant, alarming shade of purple. He was clutching a clear plastic evidence bag as if it were the crown jewels. Behind him, Anderson and MacNab trailed along, looking both exhausted and embarrassed. "Move aside, Macbeth," Blair bellowed, ignoring Penelope Vane entirely. "I told you it would be simple. While you have been wandering around looking for a free scone, my team has been doing actual police work. Look at this." He thrust the plastic bag under Hamish's nose. Inside was a heavy silver cigarette case, tarnished by age, but still unmistakably expensive. Engraved on the front were the initials AH, found it 10 yards from the sheep dip, Blair crowed, his chest swelling with pride, hidden in a clump of gorse. "It belongs to Colonel Halberton Smythe. The postmistress tells me the colonel was threatened by Croft. The daughter tells you the colonel was out in the rain all night. It is an open and shut case. Motive, opportunity, and now, the physical evidence. I am going up to the castle now to make the arrest. It is a murder, after all, and I have found the murderer." Hamish stared at the silver case. He knew that case. He had seen it on the colonel's desk a dozen times, but he also remembered something else, something Blair was too blinded by his own ambition to consider. "Sir," Hamish said, his voice reaching a level of exaggerated humility, "the colonel is a very particular man. He is also a man of great sentiment. He gave that case to Crispin Croft 5 years ago, after Croft helped him with some stock market business in London. It was a gift. The colonel has not carried it since. It was in Croft's possession, not the colonel's." Blair's face froze. The purple hue shifted toward a muddy grey. "You are lying, Macbeth. You are just trying to protect the gentry because you want to keep your cozy little life here." "I am not lying, sir. If you open the case, you will see a small inscription inside, to Crispin, with gratitude. The Colonel showed it to me himself when he was bragging about his London connections last Christmas. If it was found in the gorse, it means it fell out of Croft's pocket during a struggle, or someone threw it there to make it look like the Colonel was involved. Blair snatched the bag back, his hand shaking with rage. He peered through the plastic at the hinge of the case, though he could not read the inscription through the glare. The sheer confidence in Hamish's voice had clearly sowed a seed of doubt. I will be the judge of what this means. Macbeth, even if it was Croft's, it proves there was a struggle. It proves it was not an accident. Aye, sir, Hamish said, his eyes flicking back to Penelope Vane, who was watching the scene with a sharp, calculating intensity. It proves someone wanted us to think the Colonel did it. It is a red herring, plain as a pikestaff, and whoever planted it must have known about the gift. Blair let out a frustrated growl and turned on his heel, gesturing for his subordinates to follow. I am going to the castle anyway. I want a statement from the Colonel. And you, Macbeth, stay out of my way. If I find out you are withholding more information, I will have you directing traffic in the middle of a Strathbane roundabout by Monday. As the doors slammed shut behind the DCI, Hamish turned back to Penelope. She was smiling now, a cold, thin expression that did not reach her eyes. Well, Constable, she murmured. It seems your boss is a bit of a fool, but you? You are much more interesting than you look. Hamish didn't smile back. He was thinking about the blue feather in his pocket and the spotless shoes Penelope was wearing. She claimed she hadn't left the hotel, yet she knew exactly how much the village disliked Croft. The trap was beginning to take shape, but he needed one more piece of the puzzle, the motive that went beyond a simple business betrayal. He bowed slightly to her and walked out, his mind already moving toward the next move in this deadly Highland dance. Hamish stepped out of the hotel and inhaled the salt-stung air of the harbour. The mist had finally pulled back to the peaks, leaving the village of Lochdubh looking like a postcard that had been left out in the rain. He watched Blair's car disappear up the hill toward the castle, the blue lights still flashing with self-important urgency. Blair was hunting for a motive in a silver case and a land dispute, but Hamish knew that while money and land could make a man angry, only something far more intimate could make a person stand in the freezing rain on a desolate ridge, to push a man into a pit of arsenic. He walked along the stone pier, his boots clicking rhythmically. Child, sniffing at a discarded fish head with more enthusiasm than he had shown all morning. Hamish's mind returned to Penelope Vane. She was sharp, bitter, and certainly had the means. But would a woman like that, so obsessed with her own comfort, risk the mud and the filth of a sheep dip for a business grudge? No. Penelope was the type to hire a lawyer to ruin a man's life, not a person to ruin her own manicure by committing murder. He paused by the small, whitewashed cottage of Mrs. Gentle. She was a woman who lived up to her name only in the sense that she moved quietly. In reality, she was the village's most prolific weaver, and her loom sat by a window that overlooked the road to the messy entire Croft. Hamish had often found that those who sat in silence, working with their hands, saw the things that the shouting men missed. Morning, Mrs. Gentle, Hamish called out as he leaned over her low garden wall. That's a fine bit of tweed you're working on there. The old woman looked up, her fingers never stopping their intricate dance. It's for the minister's wife, Hamish, a heavy weight for the winter. You're looking for the truth about the Englishman, I suppose. The whole village is talking about nothing else. I am. You see a lot from that window, I'm thinking. Did Mr. Croft have many visitors that didn't arrive in a cloud of dust and a fancy car? Mrs. Gentle slowed her work. He was a man who thought he was very clever, Hamish. He used to walk down this road in the evenings, thinking no one was watching. But I saw him. He wasn't always alone. There was a girl. A local girl. Hamish felt a cold prickle at the back of his neck. A girl? From the village? She'd meet him at the edge of the woods. He'd bring her flowers, the kind you buy in a shop, not the ones that grow in the glen. He was promising her the world, I think. Telling her he'd take her away from this damp little puddle, as he called it. And who was she? Mrs. Gentle. It was young Mary, the girl who helps out at the hotel. A sweet thing, but far too impressionable for a man with teeth that white and a heart that black. Hamish thanked her and moved on, his pace quickening. Mary was the niece of Rory, the barman. She was a quiet, shy girl who had always seemed a bit overwhelmed by the bustle of the hotel guests. If Croft had been dallying with her, he wasn't just building a resort, he was playing with the one thing a Highlander valued more than land. Family honour. He found Mary in the hotel's laundry room, surrounded by steam and the smell of hot linens. She looked up as he entered, her face pale and her eyes red-rimmed from crying. "Oh, Constable," she whispered, twisting a white pillowcase in her hands. "It's a terrible thing that has happened." "It is indeed, Mary," Hamish said, his voice gentle. "I heard you and Mr. Croft were friends. He was a man who promised a lot, wasn't he?" Mary broke down then, the words tumbling out in a frantic rush. Croft hadn't been in love with her, he had been using her to find out who owned the various parcels of land surrounding the entire Croft. He had promised to marry her, to take her to London, but only if she could get her uncle Rory to sell a small strip of land that controlled the water rights to the hill. When Rory had refused, Croft had turned cruel, mocking her, and threatening to tell the whole village she had been throwing herself at him. "He was going to shame me, Hamish," she sobbed. "He laughed at me. She said I was just a local convenience, until he got what he wanted." Hamish felt a surge of cold anger. It wasn't about an eco-resort or a land dispute. It was about a man who viewed people as objects to be used and discarded. Croft hadn't been murdered because he was a businessman, he had been murdered because he was a bully who had pushed a quiet, proud family too far. He left the laundry room and found Rory at the bar, cleaning glasses with a mechanical, joyless intensity. The man didn't look up when Hamish approached. "You knew, didn't you, Rory?" Hamish asked softly. "You knew what he was doing to Mary." Rory stopped cleaning. He looked at Hamish, his eyes hard and flat. He was a parasite, Hamish. He came here with his money and his lies, thinking he could buy whatever he wanted. He thought we were all just backdrop for his fancy life. He didn't care who he hurt. "And you saw him yesterday?" "Up on the ridge." Rory didn't answer immediately. He set the glass down with a slow, deliberate click. "I saw him. I went up there to tell him to stay away from her. He was standing by that sheep dip, laughing. He told me I was a peasant, and that Mary was lucky he had even looked at her. He said he'd have the land one way or another." Hamish realized then that the motive was the most basic one of all. Protection. It wasn't greed. It was the desperate act of a man trying to save his family from a predator. But as he looked at Rory, he noticed something. Rory was a sturdy man, but he was getting on in years, and he had a bad hip from a fall in the winter. Could he have wrestled a man like Croft into a tank, or was there someone else? Someone who had been helpful all along, guiding the investigation away from the truth. G's mind flashed back to the Sassenach tension and the way the crime had been discovered. Archie McLean. Archie, who was Rory's cousin and had been protective of Mary since she was a child. Archie, who knew every inch of that ridge and every stone of that sheep dip. Hamish leaned against the bar, his heart heavy. The honest man title of the case felt like a bitter joke now. Croft had been anything but honest, and the men who had killed him were perhaps the most honest men in the villages who protected their own. But the law didn't care about honor or protection, it cared about dead bodies in sheep dips. "I'll be needing to speak with Archie again, Rory," Hamish said, his voice barely a whisper. "I think he saw more than he told me." Rory looked at him, a flicker of understanding passing between them. "Do what you have to do, Hamish. But remember, some people deserve to be in a hole." Hamish walked out into the cooling afternoon, the weight of the truth pressing down on him. He had found the motive, and it was as human and petty as a broken heart and a bruised ego. Now, he just had to decide how the story would end, and how he would keep DCV Blair from destroying the lives of two men who had simply had enough of being treated like dirt. He whistled for lugs, but for the first time in his career, he didn't feel like the smartest man in the room. He just felt like a man who wanted to go home and close the door. The sun was beginning to dip behind the mountains, casting long, dark shadows over Lochdubh. The peace of the village was a fragile thing, held together by silence and shared secrets. Hamish knew that by tomorrow, that peace would be tested. He had the pieces now, the feather, the letter, the girl, and the pride of a Highland family. The trial that remained was to set the trap, and to do it in a way that would not leave the village he loved in ruins. He climbed into his Land Rover, the engine's groan echoing his own weariness. The hidden motive had been revealed, and it was far darker than any land dispute could ever be. It was the darkness of a man who thought he was better than the people around him, and the darkness of those who had proven him wrong in the most final way possible. He drove toward Archie's cottage, the wheels churning the mud of the coastal road. The investigation was almost over, but the hardest part was yet to come. He had to be a policeman, but he also had to be a neighbor. And in Lochdubh, those two things were often at war. As he reached the gate, he saw Archie sitting on his porch, staring out at the water. The man didn't move as Hamish pulled up. He just waited. And Hamish, the man who knew how to listen to what people didn't say, knew exactly what Archie was thinking. The truth was out, and the Highlands would never be quite the same again. Croft had wanted to change Lochdubh, and in a way, he had. He had turned honest men into murderers, and he had left a quiet constable with a choice that would haunt him long after the mist had cleared. Hamish stayed at the gate of Archie McLean's cottage for a long, silent minute, the damp cold of the evening beginning to seep through his regulation trousers. Archie hadn't moved. He remained a motionless silhouette against the darkening wood of the porch, staring out at the grey, unblinking eye of the loch. The silence between them was thick, laden with the unsaid things that always governed life in Lochdubh. Hamish knew that if he pushed now, if he acted like a real policeman from the city, Archie would clam up tighter than a frozen cockle. He had to be the Hamish they expected, the one who was a bit slow on the uptake, and more concerned with his next meal than a grand arrest. "It's a fine evening for staring, Archie," Hamish said, his voice a gentle, melodic lilt. "Though I imagine the view is a bit cluttered with all those blue lights up at the castle. DCY's Blair is in a rare state. He's found the Colonel's cigarette case, and he's convinced the old man did it. It's a pity. The Colonel's heart isn't what it was. A night in the cells at Strathbane might just be the end of him." He saw Archie's shoulders stiffen, just a fraction. "But then," Hamish continued, "Blair is a man who misses the trees for the forest. He hasn't even looked at the secondary evidence. The London lady, Miss Vane, has been talking. She's a sharp one, that. She told me she saw someone on the ridge. Not the Colonel, someone shorter. Someone who dropped a very distinctive brass button from a ghillie's jacket. I've got it in my pocket right now." Hamish patted his pocket, though it contained nothing but a spare lead for lugs and a crumpled receipt. Archie's eyes flickered toward Hamish's jacket, a flash of something like a trapped animal's panic behind his weathered eyelids. "A button, you say?" Archie asked, his voice rasping like sandpaper on stone. "Aye, a brass one with a stag's head. Very common, I suppose, but this one has a peculiar scratch across the eye. Miss Vane says she knows the man who wore it anywhere. I have told her to stay at the hotel until tomorrow morning, when the specialist arrives from the city with the forensic magnification kit. It's a new thing, Archie. Can see DNA on a thread from 50 paces, or so they tell me." Hamish didn't wait for a reply. He gave a small, lazy wave and climbed back into the Land Rover, leaving the seed of doubt to germinate in the fertile soil of Archie's guilt. He drove straight to the Tommel Castle Hotel, but he didn't go to the kitchen this time. He went into the public bar. It was crowded, the air thick with the smell of damp wool and the nervous energy of a village under siege. Rory was behind the taps, his movements jerky and uncoordinated. Hamish made a point of looking tired and flustered. He leaned against the bar and let out a theatrical sigh. "A double whiskey, Rory, and make it a large one. I'm about at the end of my tether with this lot from Strathbane." The bar went quiet. Every ear in the room was tuned to the frequency of the law. "Blair is making a mess of it," Hamish announced loudly to the room. "He's got the Colonel in his sights, but I've got the real evidence sitting in a jar on my desk at the station. That brass button is going to hang someone, and I'm just hoping it's not a friend. I've got to head back there now to meet the transport from Glasgow. They're coming for the evidence at 10 o'clock tonight. I'm just popping in here to grab a bite before the long night starts. I've left the station unlocked, no one ever bothers it, but I suppose I should get back before someone decides to play a prank." He caught Rory's eye. The bartender's face was a mask of pale exhaustion. Hamish took his whiskey, downed it in one, and turned to the room. "If any of you see Archie, tell him to stay away from the ridge. The police dogs will be out later, and they're not as friendly as lugs here." He whistled for the dog and marched out, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. The trap was set. He had lied about the button, lied about the specialist, and lied about the DNA. Most importantly, he had provided a window of opportunity. Between now and 10 o'clock, the station was unprotected, and the evidence that could hang a friend was sitting right there for the taking. He didn't drive to the station. Instead, he drove the Land Rover half a mile past it, tucked it into a hidden track behind a stand of Scots pines, and walked back through the heather. The rain had started again, a fine, stinging mist that turned the world into a monochromatic blur. He reached the police station from the rear, slipping through the back door deliberately left ajar. He didn't turn on the lights. He sat in the darkness of the small side office, the smell of old paper and cold peat smoke surrounding him. Luggs sat at his feet, sensing the tension and remaining perfectly still. Hamish checked his watch. It was 9:15. He had created a ghost brass button that didn't exist to haunt the man who had actually stood over the sheep dip. He knew how the mind of a good man worked when he had done a bad thing. He wouldn't want the colonel to suffer. But more than that, he wouldn't be able to live with the idea of a scientific proof of his presence. In the Highlands, you could argue with a man, but you couldn't argue with a machine from Glasgow. The minutes crawled by, measured by the rhythmic dripping of a leak in the gutter. Then, the sound of a footfall. It wasn't the heavy, confident stride of a city man, it was the light, careful tread of someone used to walking on uneven ground. The front door of the station creaked open. The floorboards in the main office groaned. A flashlight beam cut through the darkness, sweeping across the desk, searching for the jar that Hamish had described. Hamish stood up, his tall shadow stretching across the wall. He didn't pull his truncheon. He didn't shout. He simply stepped into the doorway, his silhouette framed by the dim light from the street lamp outside. "It's a long walk from the hotel in the rain, isn't it?" Hamish said softly. The flashlight beam whirled around, catching Hamish in its blinding glare. But Hamish didn't blink. He knew the man behind the light, and he knew the weight of the secret that had brought him here. The trap had snapped shut, and the piece of Lochdubh was about to be broken one last time. The flashlight beam didn't just waver, it dropped, the circle of white light skittering across the scarred wooden floorboards to rest on Hamish's scuffed boots. In the sudden, harsh glare, Archie McLean looked like a man who had already been buried and dug back up. His face was a map of exhaustion, his skin the color of old parchment, and his eyes, usually so keen for the movement of a deer or the flight of a bird, were hollowed out by a despair that went deeper than any fear of the law. He stood there, his hand trembling so violently that the flashlight clattered against the side of the desk, its beam dancing erratically across the posters of missing persons and sheep-dipping regulations that adorned the walls of the small station. "There is no button, Archie," Hamish said, his voice a low, mournful sound that seemed to vibrate in the cramped office. He didn't move from the doorway, his tall frame a solid barrier against the night. "I never found a brass button with a stag's head. I never found a scratch across an eye. It was just a story I told to see who would come looking for it. A man with a clean conscience wouldn't care about a bit of metal in a jar, but a man carrying the weight of a dead Sassenach, well, that's a different matter entirely, isn't it?" He let out a long, ragged breath that sounded like a sob caught in his throat. He slumped against the desk, the flashlight finally slipping from his fingers to roll across the floor, its light now pointing uselessly at a spider, making its way toward the radiator. "You always were too clever for your own good, Macbeth," Archie whispered, his voice cracking. "The village thinks you're a fool, a lazy boy who'd rather poach a salmon than serve a warrant. But I knew you saw things the others missed. You see the heart of people, and that's a dangerous thing in a place like Lochdubh, where hearts are so often hidden." Hamish sighed, a sound of genuine regret. He reached out and clicked on the desk lamp, the sudden yellow glow making them both squint. The station felt smaller now, crowded with the reality of what was happening. "I saw the blue feather, Archie. It didn't come from a hat. Penelope Vane would not be caught dead in a sheep dip, and she certainly would not be standing on a ridge in the middle of a Highland gale. That feather was a law, planted just like the cigarette case. You and Rory thought you were being clever, didn't you? Using the Sassenach lady and the colonel as shields. You knew Blair would jump at the chance to arrest someone with a title or a London address. You figured if the police were busy chasing the gentry, they'd never look at a couple of local men protecting a girl's honor." Archie's head snapped up, a flash of the old fire in his eyes. He was a beast, Hamish. He was going to ruin Mary. He was going to shame her and steal the land that has been in our family since the clearings. He laughed at us. He stood by that tank and told us we were nothing but set dressing for his new world. Rory didn't mean to do it. He just wanted to talk. But Croft, he swung at him. He called Rory a peasant. I couldn't stand by and watch. I didn't mean for him to drown. Not really. I just wanted him to stop talking. I wanted him to feel the cold of the water he was so keen to build his glass palace over. And now he's dead, Hamish said flatly. And Rory's in the bar drinking himself into a stupor while you're here trying to steal a ghost. It won't work, Archie. The truth is, like a peat fire, you can smother it for a while, but it will eventually find a way to the surface. For a moment, the silence returned, heavier than the rain outside. Then something in Archie broke. It wasn't the sorrow of a repentant man, but the frantic, cornered panic of a wild animal. He lunged. Despite his age and his weathered frame, Archie moved with a desperate, wiry strength. He didn't go for Hamish, he dove for the window, thinking to shatter the glass and disappear into the darkness of the moor, where no city-born policeman could ever hope to find him. But Hamish Macbeth was not a city-born policeman. He was a man of the mountains, a man who had spent his life chasing stray sheep across scree and tracking poachers through the deepest glens. With a speed that would have shocked DC Fars, Blair, Hamish moved. He didn't use a club or a heavy hand, he used the momentum of Archie's own flight. He caught the older man by the shoulder, his long fingers locking like iron bands, and pivoted. The two of them stumbled into the main office, crashing against the heavy wooden counter. Archie fought with the strength of the damned, kicking and scratching, his boots scuffing the floorboards in a frantic rhythm. Lugs began to bark, a sharp, piercing sound that filled the station. Hamish grunted as an elbow caught him in the ribs, but he didn't let go. He wrestled Archie toward the floor, using his weight to pin the man's arms. It was a messy, undignified struggle, the kind that never made it into the official police manuals. Hamish's hat was knocked askew, and a button popped off his own tunic, but he held on until Archie's strength finally spent itself. "Stop it, Archie," Hamish gasped, his face pressed against the rough wool of Archie's jacket. "It's over. There's nowhere to go. You can't run from the loch, and you can't run from yourself." Archie went limp, his body shaking with silent sobs. Hamish slowly let go, standing up and brushing the dust from his uniform. He looked down at the broken man on the floor, feeling a profound sense of weariness. This was the part of the job he hated, the part where the lines between right and wrong were blurred by the salt of human tears. He had caught the killer, but he felt no triumph, only a cold, hollow ache. "I'm sorry, Archie," Hamish whispered, adjusting his tunic. "I truly am. But the law has a long memory, even in Lochdubh." He reached for the telephone to make the call he had been dreading, his hand hovering over the receiver as the rain continued to beat its relentless, rhythmic tattoo against the window pane. The confrontation was finished, but the reckoning was only just beginning. He stood there for a long moment, listening to the silence of the station and the heavy breathing of the man at his feet. He knew that Blair would be here soon, shouting and preening, ready to take the credit for a case he had tried his best to ruin. Hamish looked at the empty jar on the desk, the one he had used as a decoy. Trite. It was a simple trick, a bit of village theatre, but it had worked because it relied on the one thing Croft had never understood, that in the Highlands, a man's conscience is his most relentless pursuer. He picked up the receiver and began to dial the number for the Strathbane headquarters, his gaze fixed on the darkness outside. The trap had been a success, but as the dial turned, Hamish felt the weight of the promotion he so desperately wanted to avoid looming over him like the mountains themselves. He would have to think quickly if he wanted to remain the lazy constable of Lochdubh. Hamish stood by the telephone, the receiver still warm in his hand, looking down at Archie McLean with a mixture of pity and calculated desperation. The gravity of the situation was settling into the floorboards of the small Lochdubh police station, alongside the mud and the spent adrenaline of their scuffle. Hamish knew the clock was ticking. In a matter of minutes, he had to decide the trajectory of his entire future. If he acted like the brilliant detective he actually was, he would be lauded by the chief constable in Strathbane. There would be a formal commendation, a flurry of newspaper interest, and a mandatory promotion that would see him stripped of his mountains, his loch, and his quiet life, only to be deposited into the grey, concrete heart of a city precinct. To Hamish, that prospect was far more terrifying than any murderer. He looked at Archie, who was now sitting on the floor with his back against a filing cabinet, looking small and defeated. "Archie," Hamish said, his voice dropping into a low conspiratorial hum. "Listen to me, and listen well. DCI Blair will be here within 20 minutes. She is a man with the vanity of a peacock and the deductive skills of a ham sandwich. He wants a victory. He wants to be the one who broke the cleverest criminal in the Highlands. If I tell him I caught you with a trick and a bit of wrestling, he'll be annoyed that a peasant did his work for him. But if we play this right, if we make it seem like your conscience was shattered by his masterful presence earlier today, then he gets his glory, and I get to stay in Lochdubh." Archie wiped his eyes with a shaking hand, looking up at the tall constable. "What are you asking, Hamish?" "I have killed a man. There's no escaping that." "There is no escaping the law, Archie. No, you'll have to face the court. But the way the story is told matters. If you tell Blair that his brilliant interrogation at the hotel and his sharp eyes regarding the cigarette case made you realize the game was up, he will be so blinded by his own brilliance that he won't ask too many questions about why you're here now. I'll tell him you came to find me because you were terrified of his next move. You're a man who broke under the weight of professional police pressure. Do you understand? Not a man caught by a lazy policeman lie about a brass button." Archie nodded slowly, a flicker of understanding passing through his weary mind. He didn't care about Blair's ego, but he trusted Hamish. He knew Hamish belonged to the village, and if this lie helped Hamish stay, it was the least he could do after the mess he had made. Hamish then picked up the phone and dialed the Strathbane headquarters. When the operator connected him to Blair's office, the DCI's voice barked through the line like a dog with a sore throat. "Macbeth, this better be an apology for your insolence earlier," Blair roared. "Do no, sir," Hamish replied, his voice becoming a masterpiece of servile, wide-eyed admiration. "It's much more than that, sir. I'm calling to report that your strategy has worked perfectly. It was just as you predicted at the hotel. Your focus on the physical evidence and your commanding presence. It was too much for the local conscience. Archie McLean is here at the station, sir. He's completely broken. He says he couldn't handle another minute of knowing you were on the trail. He's ready to confess, but he's insisted that he will only speak to the man who truly outsmarted him. He's waiting for you, sir." There was a long silence on the other end of the line, the sound of Blair's heavy breathing the only noise, as the DC-5s processed this sudden elevation of his status. Then, his voice changed. It became grand, patronizing, and filled with a nauseating smugness. "I knew it, Macbeth. I told Anderson, didn't I? I told him that these hill people only respond to a firm hand and a superior intellect. I'm leaving now. I shall be there in record time. Keep him isolated. Do not, repeat, do not interfere with the suspect. I want the full credit for the confession recorded under my supervision. Do you understand, you ginger streak of nothing?" "Perfectly, sir," Hamish said, suppressing a grin. "I'm just the witness to your triumph." 20 minutes later, the quiet street of Lochdubh was once again invaded by the screaming sirens and flashing lights of the Strathbane police. 2 patrol cars and Blair's black sedan screeched to a halt outside the station. Blair practically tumbled out of the car, his face flushed with the heat of impending glory. He marched into the station, followed by a weary Anderson and MacNab, who looked like they had spent the last hour being lectured on Blair's greatness. Hamish stood at attention, his cap held over his heart, looking for all the world like a simpleton who had just witnessed a miracle. "He's in the back room, sir. Very quiet. He's been asking for you every 5 minutes." Blair didn't even look at Hamish. He brushed past him, his chest puffed out so far that his waistcoat buttons were under visible strain. He entered the side office where Archie sat waiting. Hamish watched through the open door as Blair hovered over the seated crofter. "So, McLean," Blair boomed, his voice echoing off the walls, "you finally realized that you couldn't hide from a detective chief inspector, eh? You thought you could hide behind the mist and the rocks, but my investigation into the land deeds and that silver case was too much for you, wasn't it?" Archie looked at Hamish, saw the slight nod, and then turned back to Blair. "Aye, sir," Archie said, his voice flat. "It was the way you looked at that cigarette case. I knew then that a man of your experience would find the rest. I couldn't live with the fear of what you would do next." Blair turned to Anderson, a look of pure, unadulterated triumph on his face. "Did you hear that? Write it down." Suspect admitted to being overwhelmed by the DCI's deductive process. "This is textbook, Anderson, absolute textbook." For the next hour, Hamish stood in the shadows of the main office, watching as Blair dominated the scene. The DCI dictated the confession, adding flourishes of his own investigative brilliance to Archie's simple admission of the struggle at the sheep dip. He completely ignored the blue feather, the brass button lie, and the fact that Hamish had been the one to actually secure the man. To Blair, Hamish was merely the furniture, a convenient witness to his own ascension. When the time came to take Archie away, Blair paused at the door. He looked back at Hamish, who was currently leaning against the counter, looking as lazy and unmotivated as ever. "Well, Macbeth," Blair sneered, "I suppose even a useless peasant like you can be of some service if he knows how to follow orders. I'll mention in my report that you managed to keep the station open while I solved the crime, but don't expect a promotion. You don't have the temperament for real police work. You're lucky to be here at all." "I know that, sir," Hamish said, his voice a picture of humility. "I'm just happy to have seen a master at work." As the cars sped away into the night, taking the killer and the credit with them, Hamish let out a long, slow sigh of relief. The danger had passed. He wasn't going to be a hero. He wasn't going to be promoted. He was just Hamish Macbeth, the lazy constable of a quiet village, and he was staying exactly where he belonged. He reached down and ruffled Lug's ears, the dog looking up with a knowing wag of his tail. "Well, boy," Hamish whispered, "the Sassenach is gone, the colonel is safe, and we still have our stove. I'd say that's a fair day's work for a man of my limited abilities." He walked to the window, watching the tail lights disappear into the Highland dark, perfectly content to be the smartest man in a room that everyone thought was empty. Thursday dawned with a sky the color of a pale bluebell, the kind of morning that made the previous 48 hours feel like a fever dream born of damp wool and cheap whiskey. Hamish Macbeth stood on the step of the police station, a broom in hand, and a lingering ache in his side where Archie's elbow had made its mark. The village of Lochdubh was stirring, but it was a different sort of movement than the day before. The frantic energy brought by Crispin Croft and the arrival of the Strathbane police had evaporated, leaving behind the heavy, comfortable silence of a place that had successfully purged a foreign object from its system. Hamish watched the post van rattle past, the driver giving a short, solemn nod. The news of Archie's arrest had travelled through the village faster than a Highland gale, but there was no sense of outrage. Instead, there was a quiet, sombre acceptance. In Lochdubh, people understood the price of protection. They knew that sometimes, to keep the peace, a man had to lose his own. He spent the morning performing domestic chores that DC5's Blair would have found beneath the dignity of a detective, but which Hamish found strangely therapeutic. He scrubbed the floor where the struggle had taken place, erased the muddy bootprints of the Strathbane officers, and carefully filed away the paperwork that would officially close the file on the death of an honest man. The title of the case file sat on his desk, a stark reminder of the irony defining the entire investigation. Crispin Croft had been anything but honest, yet in the eyes of the law, he was the victim, and the men who had sought to protect a young girl's future were the villains. A light tap at the door interrupted his ruminations. He didn't need to look up to know who it was. The scent of expensive perfume, something floral but with a sharp, intelligent edge, preceded her. Priscilla Halberton-Smythe stepped into the station, looking radiant in a tweed suit that matched the morning sky. "I saw the headlines in the Strathbane Gazette, Hamish," she said, her voice carrying a hint of amusement. "Blair breaks Highland murderer. It's quite a glowing tribute to his investigative genius. I particularly liked the part where he describes tracking the suspect through the treacherous terrain of the local psyche." Hamish leaned his broom against the wall and offered her the only chair that didn't have a pile of old National Geographics on it. He was very proud of that phrase, Priscilla. He spent 20 minutes refining it before he left. "I believe he thinks it makes him sound like a poet. And you, of course, were mentioned as assisting with the administrative duties," she noted, her blue eyes narrowing. "Why do you do it, Hamish? Why let a man like that walk away with your work? You could have been the hero of the hour. My father is already telling everyone that you're the only one with any sense in the whole department, even if you did let Blair stomp around the castle like a rogue elephant." Hamish shrugged, a slow, lazy movement. "If I were a hero, Priscilla, I would be a hero in a city office. I would be wearing a suit and attending meetings about budget allocations and urban crime statistics. Here, I'm just the man who looks after the sheep and keeps an eye on the poachers. I like my life here. I like the way the loch looks in the evening, and I like knowing that I can go for a walk without checking my watch. Fame is a very noisy thing, and I prefer the quiet." Priscilla sighed, a sound of frustrated affection. "You are an impossible man, Hamish Macbeth, but I suppose that's why you're still here. My father wanted me to thank you, by the way." She realized this morning that he had misplaced his cigarette case days ago. He had left it at the hotel after a lunch meeting with Croft. He was quite relieved that Blair didn't try to pin the whole thing on him, though he's still grumbling about the police harassment. "Tell the Colonel he is welcome," Hamish said. "And tell him to keep a better eye on his belongings. Red herrings are all well and good in stories, but they are a messy business in real life." They talked for a while longer, the easy, familiar conversation of two people who understood each other's silences. When Priscilla finally left, the station felt a little colder, a little emptier. Hamish watched her drive away, then whistled for lugs. It was time for his afternoon patrol, which usually involved a slow walk to the hotel and a check on the state of the harbour. The Tommel Castle Hotel was quiet. The Sassenach guests had mostly checked out, fleeing the sudden reality of Highland violence for the safer, more predictable comforts of the south. Rory was behind the bar, his face a mask of professional neutrality, but there was a new tiredness in the set of his shoulders. Mary was nowhere to be seen. Hamish had heard she had gone to stay with an aunt in Ullapool until the trial was over, and the gossip had died down. He didn't mention Archie. He didn't mention the sheep dip. He simply ordered a coffee and sat by the window, watching the gulls wheeling over the water. The village was returning to its routine, the dark undercurrent of the murder already being absorbed into the long, complicated history of the Glen. In a year's time, It would be just another story told over a dram of whiskey, the tale of the Englishman who thought he could buy the hills and ended up a part of them. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the peaks, Hamish made his way back to his own small quarters. He built up the fire in his ancient stove, the smell of burning peat. The fire in the small peat stove crackled with a low, contented rhythm, casting long, dancing shadows across the whitewashed walls of Hamish Macbeth's kitchen. Outside, the Highland night had settled in with a vengeance, the wind whistling through the eaves of the police station, and the rain drumming a steady, familiar tattoo against the dark glass. It was a cold, lonely sound, but to Hamish, sitting in his favourite armchair with lugs resting his chin on his boot, it was the sound of safety. It was the sound of a man who had successfully navigated the treacherous shoals of professional ambition and come out the other side exactly where he wanted to be. Nowhere in particular. On the small deal table beside him lay a copy of the Strathbane Sentinel. The front-page photograph featured DC Fast Blair, looking remarkably like a puffed-up bullfrog, standing on the steps of the courthouse. The headline blared in bold sensationalist type: "Mastermind Blair cracks Highland murder. Crofter confesses to sheep-dip killing." The article went on at great length about Blair's encyclopedic knowledge of land law and his unrelenting pressure on the local criminal element. Hamish's name appeared once, buried in the final paragraph, as the officer who had secured the station during the DCI's absence. Hamish reached out, picked up the paper, and without a trace of bitterness, tore the front page into thin strips. He fed them one by one into the stove, watching the ink of Blair's self-satisfied face curl and blacken before vanishing into the orange glow. To anyone else, the lack of credit would have been an insult, a professional slap in the face. To Hamish, it was a shield. Blair's ego had once again served as the perfect camouflage, ensuring that the authorities in Strathbane would continue to view their Lochdubh constable as a slow-witted, lazy Highland fixture, rather than a threat to their own promotions. "He's happy, lugs," Hamish murmured, the dog's tail thumping twice against the floorboards. "He gets his medal and his headline, and we get to keep our stove and our peace. It's a fair trade, wouldn't you say?" The case was officially closed, but the echoes of it lingered in the quiet corners of the village. Archie McLean was in a cell in Strathbane, awaiting trial. The village had already begun a collection for his legal defence, led by Mrs. Kennedy and, surprisingly, the Colonel. It was whispered in the Tommel Castle Hotel that Archie wouldn't serve a day more than was absolutely necessary. The local consensus was that Croft's death was less a murder and more a long overdue bit of Highland pest control. The honest man of the case title had been Croft, but as Hamish stared into the flames, he knew the only honesty in the whole sordid affair had belonged to Archie and Roramen, who had loved their own enough to do the unthinkable. A soft, muffled thump at the back door broke the silence. Hamish stood up, his joints protesting the movement, and walked into the small scullery. When he opened the door, there was no one there, only the wet, dark night and the smell of the sea. But on the mat sat a heavy, burlap sack. Hamish pulled it inside and opened it. Resting on a bed of damp ferns was a magnificent, silvery Atlantic salmon, its scales shimmering even in the dim light. There was no note, but none was needed. It was a gift from the poaching fraternity of Lochdubh, a silent acknowledgement of the man who had seen everything and chosen to tell the story that kept the village whole. "Well now," Hamish said, a small, wry smile touching his lips. "It seems we won't be having tin beans for dinner after all." He set about cleaning the fish with the practiced, efficient movements of a man who had done this many times before, usually under the cover of moonlight. As he worked, he thought about Priscilla. She had stopped by earlier that evening, ostensibly to drop off some magazines for the station, but her eyes had held a lingering question. She knew, of course. She knew exactly how Blair had come by his confession. She had offered him a look of profound, quiet admiration, a look that had made Hamish's heart do a strange, uncomfortable somersault. But the gap between the daughter of the castle and the constable of the village remained as wide as the loch, and Hamish was content to leave it so. A romantic complication was just another form of work, and he was currently off duty. By the time the salmon was simmering in a pan with a knob of butter and a splash of milk, the station felt like the centre of the world. The aroma filled the kitchen, pushing back the damp chill of the Highlands. Hamish sat back down, a mug of strong, hot coffee in his hand, and watched the fire sink into a deep, ember-red glow. The Sassenach investment mogul was gone, his glass-fronted eco-resort a dead dream on a mist-shrouded ridge. The MC entire croft would remain a heap of stones, a monument to a past that refused to be paved over. The roads would remain rutted. The mist would continue to hide the secrets of the mountains, and the people of Lochdubh would continue to live their lives at a pace that no London clock could ever measure. Hamish felt a deep, soul-level satisfaction. He had protected his village, he had protected his friends, and most importantly, he had protected his own right to be exactly who he was. He wasn't a hero, he wasn't a rising star, and he wasn't a lion of the north. He was just Hamish Macbeth, a man with a dog, a stove, and a very fresh salmon. As he began to eat, the telephone in the front office let out a single, half-hearted ring before falling silent, as if the caller had thought better of disturbing the peace of the night. Hamish didn't even turn his head. If it was important, they would call back in the morning. And if it wasn't, the silence was a much better companion. The rain continued to fall, the wind continued to howl, and in the small, warm heart of the Lochdubh police station, the smartest man in the Highlands closed his eyes and drifted into a well-earned, lazy sleep. The peace of the Highlands had been restored, and for Constable Hamish Macbeth, that was the only reward that ever truly mattered.